watamina gabilami imuchinombo afmami kuma kastomami ikaramu okera agana garake imuchinombo asarune yotatabi tupande nostuni now watamina gabilami imuchinombo afmami kuma kastomami ikaramu okera agana garake imuchinombo now watamina gabilami imuchinombo afmami kuma kastomami ikaramu okera agana garake imuchinombo asarune yotatabi tupande nostuni now watamina gabilami imuchinombo afmami kuma kastomami ikaramu okera agana garake imuchinombo asarune yotatabi tupande nostuni now watamina gabilami imuchinombo afmami kuma kastomami ikaramu okera agana garake imuchinombo asarune yotatabi tupande nostuni now watamina gabilami imuchinombo afmami kuma kastomami ikaramu okera agana garake imuchinombo asarune yotatabi tupande nostuni now watamina gabilami imuchinombo afmami kuma kastomami ikaramu okera agana garake imuchinombo asarune yotatabi tupande nostuni now watamina gabilami imuchinombo afmami kuma kastomami ikaramu okera agana garake imuchinombo asarune yotatabi tupande nostuni.
So this is a photograph of my first day at school, and that's me there with the cat. The cat who had 3 legs and was called Tipsy, and my grandmother Aisatu Koloko, and my dad and my brother Michael. And this is a film that I made holding that family photograph. The recording that you hear is my friend Kaililu Jabril Conte, and we wrote this song together over WhatsApp Messenger during lockdown. And the song is in Timne, which is my grandmother's maternal language. It's not actually a language that I speak, but as you can see, this is also a piece of work that's about learning things in different ways. So I was trying to learn Kaililu's words phonetically, and I would record myself singing and send it back, and he'd be like, no, and he'd sing it again, and I'd sing it back. And I decided that this kind of artifact of conversation and learning became the soundtrack to this film. And I thought that that would be a nice place to start in terms of thinking about this project and where it came from, which is very much this experience of being a child in a mixed race household in Ireland. I was born in 1987. I'm 37 now. And thinking about, I didn't really have anyone to talk to me about things like that when I was growing up. Those kinds of things were not really available. We were quite a unique family. Thinking about what it was to go into school and be myself from where I came from. I also went to an Irish-speaking school, so I did everything on Gaeilge. Agus bhí sé sin simú chomá caithfí mé rá. But it was an interesting thing to have that experience of being in an Irish immersion school, being a child of mixed heritage. And this idea of identity and language were always at the core of everything. It was something that I had to kind of parse. Even bringing my homework home from school, I'd have to translate it from Irish into English to my dad, and then translate whatever help he'd given me back into Irish to do my homework. And my grandmother spoke English, she also spoke Creole and Timne, and I learned bits of those languages at home. So my house was a multilingual household. So this idea of translation, of kind of mediation, and in some ways of explanation, because there was always this thing, because I'm very, very light-skinned, and a lot of people didn't think my family were my family. And this was also a thing I had to kind of talk about. And it was like a story I got used to just telling everybody all the time. And it upset me for a long time as I was growing up that I had to constantly tell people, no, that is my dad. And then I was like, well, what do we do with things stories like that? How do we reclaim those stories and turn them into something beautiful and something that I'm also deeply proud of? And that's really the genius of this project that I'm about to talk to you about, which is called Family Lines. So this idea of the family and the line and different types of resemblance and legacy really inform the way that I work, and became a place that I wanted to begin to share. And it's been part of my work for a very long time. But when Georgina Jackson invited me to the Douglas Hyde to make a project, a solo project, it became really important to me then to also turn this into a space of invitation. And this idea of a multi-platform space, a space that was about bringing people in, and particularly people of all generations, because I was quite alone in my generation, but I remember being like 12 or 13 years old and finally seeing other people of African descent in Ireland on the bus in public space, and not feeling like we were the only black family in Dún Laoghaire, for example. And that being very exciting, and me kind of thinking about when those kids grow up, and that idea of that. And so engaging with people, cultural producers and creative people and artists, musicians who are in their 20s was something that was really, it was that generation that I was interested in engaging, but also thinking about schools and young people coming up in the world and what this project could mean to them. So while the project is very much based in my biography and exploring my specific and nuanced experience of identity in Ireland, it is also a space where those kinds of complexities and those questions can be teased out, not in a kind of an anthropological way, but in a very lived way. And there were many different aspects to the way in which Family Lines project, rather than the exhibition alone, tried to do that. So it began with a series of screenings that happened the year before the exhibition began. And so a big part of my education was actually in the United Kingdom. So I did my master's at Goldsmiths College and my PhD at Kingston University. And it was only when I was in the UK that I met other artists of African descent that were working around the same ideas that I was working in. I came into contact with histories of Black British film, for example, from the 1980s. And it became important to me to bring that work to Ireland and show it for the first time in most cases as part of an online screening project. So this idea of outreach, and it was kind of just 2021, so we're still in COVID times, and the program had to be pretty robust in terms of delivery in that way. But the screening program was almost like a road in to what was to come. This film in particular was the first film I ever saw that had a family that looked kind of like mine in it, where there's like many different skin tones and they're related, and it's a conversation about a mother passing and her memories of transition and migration. And so that was the film that I chose. And then I also chose a film, Twilight City by Black Audio Film Collective, which talked about being in London, and it's a letter that a child is writing to her mother, and that's the voiceover of the film. So these two films began the screening program, and then I invited people to choose a film and then invite somebody else to show a film. And this idea of extension and invitation becomes kind of intrinsic to the way that I build a community and build a family around a particular set of experiences and ideas. It was also accompanied by a public billboard campaign, which was for me about bringing artwork into new spaces. I'd worked with billboards previously in 2012, but again, because of COVID, it became really, really important to have things in the street and also in spaces where people who might not know about the Douglas Hyde Gallery, for example, even though it is in Trinity College, it's also kind of feels like it's in a basement to no one who's ever been there before, even though it's a huge space. But to try and bring it into those spaces that might not necessarily be considered art spaces, and also to a public that might not necessarily consider them an art public themselves. And so that kind of idea of implanting things in new space and engaging with the empty billboards of Dublin, because those events weren't happening anymore. So we also had this unique opportunity to work with that as a space that wasn't as expensive, because it's very expensive to rent public billboards usually, and it wasn't, and it was accessible. And so this idea of working with archives and the family and memory in that way became a key part of developing those images for public space. And I mean, one of the things that I really am so happy about when people talk about having been to Family Lines is that they want to see their family. And this was something someone came out after the show and said that exhibition made me want to call my mum. And this idea of the particularity and the nuance of my family as a migrant family, but also this universality of the family and the experience of childhood and how we negotiate our identities. I mean, this is a universal experience that everyone has a unique relationship with, and not everyone feels that they have the space to talk about that. And the more, I guess, different you feel from the people around you, the less easy it can be to have those conversations. And so if there's an educational element to this work, it's about demonstrating the different ways in which those conversations can be had. And of course, you know, it has I'm a practicing artist, and the output is artwork in the main, but it's also this space that brings people in. And this is how I articulate my identity. This is how I explore different aspects of myself through clay, which to me is always about the body, through these kind of boards that are kind of a timeline. And this work in particular is about different proximities of ancestors. So thinking about like a stellar explosion, like we all originated from, like Big Bang, and then an ancient animal, an ancient fossil. And then in the corner is that image of my grandmother again that we can see in the kind of close up here, but kind of repeating it and creating these kind of family resemblances through the work is also something that happens. So we see my grandmother again in this corner cut out and kind of floating, and this idea of her existence as an ancestor in space and in time, and this kind of superposition of time and space and different times and spaces and different people and things coming together and being brought together in an artwork where they can't necessarily be brought together in real life. And so the kind of magical space of an artwork is something that I want to continue to kind of work through, and it's also something that I communicate when I talk about my work and when I teach. So this idea of inheritance then is deeply embedded in the work, not just in terms of my inheritance as a Black Irish person, but my inheritance also as the child of two artists and two educators. So my mum was an art teacher and a painter, and my dad was a music teacher and a psychologist and a musician. And so this idea of the legacy of being given permission to be yourself and to be creative is also something that's embedded in my work. So this is a work that I showed at the Douglas Hyde, and I showed in also an exhibition I had in Munich. I show my mother's painting called Lament that she painted. It's a self-portrait of her when she was pregnant with me. And this mask in the background is a representation of my dad, and their relationship had already become quite difficult, and she had just lost her mother. So this is a very sad painting for her, but it's also a kind of a premonition painting in that she painted herself with blue eyes, and my mum has brown eyes, and I have blue eyes, and no one expected me to have blue eyes when I came out. So this is a strange picture in that way. And it's also almost my first portrait because I'm in the womb in this picture, and this idea of kind of who we are in relation to our parents and being versions of our parents. And I don't look like either of my parents, but this idea that I'm also kind of a clone of them, and I look like both of them, and I am like both of them. And as you grow up, you're kind of in conflict with being like your parents, and you push your family away, and you have these kinds of difficult relationship to emerge and become yourself. And then I found, like, as I grew older, like kind of building back that relationship in the ways that worked for me. And this painting is about that. And it's actually a combination of using the cloning tool, which I think is kind of interesting in Photoshop, to take my mother's original painting and to clone another version of her. And then this central figure then represents me, and the addition of hands and this idea of being held by my parents, being held in an affectionate way, being held down, being held together. All these kind of different feelings are present in the work. And this inheritance of being an artist and being encouraged and held up and encouraged to continue my work rather than discouraged. You know, I was allowed to go to art college. My mum's family fell out with her for going to art college. My dad's family never respected that he was a musician. You know, so this idea of what your parents do for you. I could find a lot of fault with my parents, but they always encouraged me to be an artist, and I was always given what I needed to do that, whether that was just to be told to keep going, or, you know, they put money aside for me to go to guitar lessons, you know, these kinds of things. Those things were valued in my house, and that idea of encouragement and also being given options, different ways of expressing myself is something that was really intrinsic to my growing up, and I feel blessed by, and I'd like to talk about that as a type of legacy as well. So this is going to be fun because this is Victory's family. So Victory has been a very big part, actually, of Family Lines. And I guess for me, actually, that your family came to that opening and your mum engaged with the work so much. And it was just like a beautiful moment for me because, in a sense, your family and your mom particularly, they were the people I really wanted to see this show. And Victory and I met through the workshop element of Family Lines, which was run by my friends and collaborators, Erin and I. And I'm just going to jump quickly to their installation. So Erin and I is a community archive for Black and migrant life in Ireland. And I invited them to occupy the Gallery 2 space called the Artist's Eye in the Douglas Hyde. And Beulah and Joselle made a beautiful installation. And the idea for us was this would be a place for people to actually come and sit and rest, and also to engage with these kind of tangible elements of their archive. And Erin and I had previously been only online. And so for us, this was a space of invitation for them to make certain elements, to invite new elements through workshop, and then also to display those elements. And so in a sense, our community made the exhibition, and it became also a space that the community could be held. And there are items from my family archive here. This is a photograph of my grandmother. This is my father's Quran. And then we had some really beautiful contributions from a number of different contributors that were invited. We also had a beautiful workshop around food culture. And we also went to Mayday rooms in the UK to work with ephemeral print archival materials from Black Irish people living in England and those communities. And we invited people from that particular intersection of community to be both Black and Irish and living in England to come and share their stories. And we did some writing workshops there. So I'm probably coming nearly to my time now. So the last thing that I wanted to speak to you about was the work in schools that we've carried on. So this idea that Family Lines began as an exhibition project in a prestigious museum space, and that operates on one level of culture. And there is a public program that brought people into that space to engage and develop that space and populate that space with new materials. But for me, it's also really important that it has a much more embedded everyday activity or quality or presence in society. And so Giselle and Beulah and myself and Julia and Rain Booth, as part of a project called Super Projects, came together to develop a learning resource specifically for children in 6th class. So we identified this as an important age because this is the age that we become aware of ourselves in social space in new ways. Our bodies are changing. We're becoming, our sense of identity is establishing itself. And there's not a lot of attention necessarily paid to conversations like that in arts practice with this age group. And so we proposed to go to Adamstown Educate together to do a 3-day workshop where we invited different practitioners of different mediums. So Toby Balagun is in this picture as a dancer, and we also invited musicians, storytellers, and Victory's family, and I guess Biazine in the extended way, also provided a beautiful meal for us. And so this was like a very special thing, and had a really, really beautiful culmination in a show in the school hall, but also as a learning resource that was available for the school to reenact at any time at their own. You know, we're not essential to this process, so it's something that they can continue to do every year if they wanted to. And that was something that also felt quite important. So the development of educational resources that have a life beyond the exhibition and aren't dependent on us to execute. So we come in and we do our thing, and there's an example there, but there's also the capacity to continue it in new and interesting ways. And yeah, so I think I'll leave it at that. And thank you so much for listening. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Alice. And we're going to have a little bit of time for some questions, because people might have questions or things they would like Alice to expand on. But for myself, I I just really think about this idea that you suggest around time and space. And that's what we've kind of wanted to really explore today, and how art and art practice can create that time and space for people to explore these very complex themes and issues in both kind of very individual ways, but at this universal way also. And I love the words that you use around like mediation, explanation, and translation. And I just think as practitioners from different fields, it's really interesting to think about all the different ways that you do that. So it's a really important part of your practice, this way that you kind of mediate and communicate and create space.
Is it on? Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, I think this idea of making different kind of qualities of time exist is something that art can do. You know, we're very focused on chronological time and productivity kind of indexed to that type of time, but there's other qualities of time, you know, and that art can make those spaces in the way that it can bring us away from productivity, you know, to actually spend time and think about things, and to be in our bodies and experience ourselves and think about ourselves in relation to the world in new ways. And that kind of space for processing that the encounter with art itself can have, but also the making of it. And so it's also, for me, about giving people who maybe haven't had a chance to do those things or are still developing as children are,
Yes.
to understand that art is a place where that work can get done. You know, you can have those conversations with yourself and your peers through a creative practice. It's not something that has to be internalized or something that has to be articulated, you know, perfectly in 3 sentences and like, you know, a census form or something like that, you know,
Yes.
that it's an experience. And I think
Yes.
that's something that's really important to me.
And maybe just as a way of kind of encouraging all of us as facilitators or people who work with young people, that in a way you just need to create the time and space, you know, for those things to occur.
Yeah, and also that it's something that actually can be done easily. And you know, like we didn't disrupt much. You know, we came in and they had, it was just before they were on their break, and we had like a couple of hours with them across a couple of days, and something that happened just after school. And we coordinated with the school around that, you know. Finding out when parents were available, when most people were around, you know, these kinds of things.
Yes.
And that all, and we worked with the local community centre that was just, Adamstown was really beautifully located, which is a community centre not even a 5-minute walk away from the school. So we had this kind of also opened the school out to these other locations that were walkable. And we walked with the class out, and this idea of coming out of the classroom to do something, but then bringing what we made back into the school. And that was a really nice thing. And, you know,
kind of breaking down the way you talk about space being fluid, that also, you know, the spaces with formal and informal and community and family.
And they had a sense of ownership over those spaces. Like that's their community centre and that's their school. And that's a really nice thing to see happen, and to see the ease at which they kind of moved through that. And it was great.
Thank you. So does anybody have any questions or comments? I might like to ask Alice about a particular project. Liz?
Thank you so much for that. It was really beautiful. I'm just wondering. Oh, sorry. Thank you. You talked. Something I just jotted down was the way to have those conversations, and I was just curious if you could expand a little bit about that. So, and how you might share with us maybe how you do that.
Well, I suppose for me it's about making myself as vulnerable as the people that I am asking to be vulnerable with me. And I think that's where the sharing of my particular sets of experiences and stories comes from. And that kind of sets a ground of equal footing. So it's not this kind of external gaze, you know, that's asking somebody to articulate themselves in a way that I can understand, but rather making a space where I share, and then that creates a space I share in my way and in my language, and other people can share in their way in their language. But that sharing and taking the first step in that openness and that vulnerability and that self-reflexivity and understanding your own positionality in relation to the people that you want to share with or you want to work with, that becomes very, very important. And so I feel like that is at a starting point. You know, I've worked in other community contexts as an artist, and that's always been how I've approached it. But it's also, it feels the most authentic and the most honest and the right way to do things from my perspective as a person. And I think, you know, we can look and break down how that methodologically makes a lot of sense as well. But yeah, if you're asking someone to give you something, you know, you give them something back, and it seems like that to me. Yeah.
Thanks, Oisin. Thank you, Alice. I really enjoyed your presentation so much. And one of the things that I particularly enjoyed was that idea of going back into deep time and our cosmic origins, and then bringing it into that connection to our own family spaces. But you mentioned having resources that live beyond an exhibition, and I just would ask you maybe to expand on that. What can it look like? How do we make them accessible to people, and what that means for you in your practice?
Well, what we did with Super Projects is that we had a special website that had the video that we made. That was a video. We had a videographer work with us for that day, and we also then developed a feedback sheet that we distributed both to the students and the teachers, but also to the artists that we worked with, and we developed a resource based on that feedback, and then that's open source, so that, you know, you can go online and see that material. And so I think that kind of generosity of that, and that's when something is publicly funded and supported by the Arts Council, you can leave things for other people. You know, they're not for sale, they're for giving, and they're for distributing and trying to permeate as many spaces as possible with. And so online, but also like through the demonstration, through the teachers also were a part of that experience with us, and they witnessed it, and the demonstration of how it can be done, and just doing it in front of people, and then they're like, oh, I could do that. And all my favorite things are, whenever I have an encounter with art, it's usually like, if I really love it, it's because it's given me permission to do something I didn't think I was allowed to do. And I feel like that's maybe what I would hope for with my work as well. And so I think that, yeah, those kinds of, like a generosity with the life cycle of something, and not necessarily it being centered on authorship of the artist, but rather a structure can be made and left behind and interacted with and developed over time.
And is that website still Super Projects, and those resources will be available if people wanted to find them?
I believe so. Julia, is it superprojects.ie or .com? .org. Better.
Superprojects.org.
Julia, we might actually put
and
that
you'll
up
see
on
many
an A4.
wonderful things that Super Projects do, because it wasn't just me that they worked with. Yeah, so we called it Let Me Show You Who I Am is the name of the project that we did. And so when you go on the Super Projects website, you'll be able to find it there and have a look.
I think we should circulate kind of resources and stuff as they come up over the day, and we can send them out to everyone at the end as well, just so we don't misspell websites and various things as I would do. Alice, I loved your presentation. Thank you so much. I'm really curious as how the work that you did with the school and with the children, how that then translates back into your own practice and your own work, and does it, like, do those two things work together, or do you see them as separate within your work?
I think it's more about the relationships that are established. Like, there's always this kind of cross-pollination with any encounter like that, but I feel like they're parallel practices that resonate with one another, rather than one feeding directly into the other and back again like that. Yeah.
Thank you.
And you work in a very interdisciplinary and collaborative way, and you talk about sort of language, you communicating in your language and leaving space and time for others to communicate in their language. I love that you're using clay, paint, digital media, film. Is that something that you've always done, or is this something that you're just always pushing yourself outwards into these new spaces?
It's interesting you ask about the clay, because when I was doing my undergraduate degree, the other job that I had was working in a NINRA, and I was working with like small preschool children, and we were working with the clay. And that's actually how I got into clay. I didn't study sculpture, I studied fine art media in NCAD. So it is actually through working with really small children with clay as how I got into clay and working with clay in that way. And I really remember distinctly this child had made like what he was calling like a controller, and it was just like 2 pieces of clay, and then he'd run like pipe cleaners along the top of it. And like, yeah, that was so interesting to me, kind of bringing materials together that like aren't supposed to be together. But like we worked with High Scope, which some people in the room might be aware of. High Scope is like an educational approach developed in America. Yeah, so it would be like after Montessori and Steiner. High Scope is another, but very much kind of focused on non-directive learning and experiential learning. And I did some training in that, and the availability of materials for children to be able to explore freely and without being told what things are for is a really big part of like just an approach to working with children, and the creation of small group time and big group time and these kind of things all have mapped onto my work in kind of very interesting ways. But I was learning those things at the same time I was learning how to be an artist in college, and so they definitely have fed each other immensely. Yeah.
I just think that's so interesting in a very discipline-based system that many of us teach in or work in, that you're kind of exploding out the boundaries of those traditional disciplines, giving us permission to put these things together.
Yeah, and I think it's also to do with, I come into contact with myself as a child in my work all the time, and that's a lot of the exploration, particularly in the clay and the animals, and even this kind of storytelling of where we came from. These are all from, we are taught how to locate ourselves, in relation to these things from a very young age. And so going back into conversation around locating myself is always also to go back in time to talk to myself about that. And yeah.
Thank you. I think I'd just like to thank Alice, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you.